Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we return from the Technicolor excess, if excess is the right word, of the Rankin Bass animated version of The Hobbit to the pages of the original book and the desaturated darkness of the Mirkwood, the halls of the Elven King. Tonight, Chapter 9 of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit barrels out of Bond. Before we get started tonight, a quick programming note. If you are joining me here live, as Hugh is here live in the chat. Hello, Hugh. I'm not going to be holding the regular Shire Reckoning after show tonight, because I have a hard out, I'm afraid, this evening, so I can't schedule that in. But what we're going to do to compensate for that is offer an extra kind of coffee date at the Red Dragon, at the Green Dragon, the Red Dragon, excuse me, a non-canonical bar also in Bywater, which maybe we will do because we'll be meeting there in the morning. We're going to do a coffee date at the Green Dragon sometime this week. Stay tuned for scheduling information. If you support Next Word on Patreon, you get access to that extra bonus show after the fact. But tonight we're going to be really focused on the text because it's just a huge turning point, and I'm aware even as I say that I've described like the last 6 chapters of The Hobbit as huge turning points, which on the one hand is completely valid because The Hobbit is primarily structured as a series of turning points, a series of transformations, a series of revisions, a series of new becomings as we follow Bilbo's adventure all the way from Bag End to the Lonely Mountain and back again. But I mentioned specifically in last week's session, or I guess in the last session focused on the text of the book, that the encounter with the spiders is the end of what was for Professor Tolkien a sustained period of composition. He then takes a break for several months before returning to the book, and when he sits down to write again, he quickly sketches the rest of the novel, and most of it, for the first time in terms of the composition, is broadly accurate to the final draft, except that the marvelous gem that Bilbo steals from Smaug's hoard isn't yet the Arkenstone. It doesn't have any political significance. It's just a fancy gem. And the Battle of the Five Armies is planned to happen not at Erebor at all, in fact, but between Mirkwood and the Misty Mountains. That is where the elves and the man and the goblins and the wargs and so forth will meet. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End, a hero of whom you may have heard, is the one who actually kills Smaug. That's all part of that original composition. Chris Stevens is joining us here live. Good evening, Chris. Good to have you with us. The idea of the Elven King's halls and the idea of escaping by barrel, in fact, is largely already here in Tolkien's mind by the time that he begins this phase of the composition. We're going to talk a little about what he was planning before we got to the idea of the barrels. But for all that this fits neatly into the schematic of what we can think of kind of casually as the back 2/3 of the novel, in terms of event and plot instance rather than length, at least, I think that this chapter is somewhat ill at ease with the rest of the book. I'm going to observe several ways in which that is true as we move through tonight's reading. There are several things about this chapter that sit strangely, uncomfortably, that sit contrary to what we understand of Middle-earth. This is one of the chapters which is most a relic of this original phase of composition. That is to say, the very pre-Lord of the Rings kind of intentionally separate from the broader legendarium, but still engaged in what John Radcliffe calls a kind of auto-plagiarism, right? As Tolkien is intentionally recycling his own work, his own ideas, his own names into his own texts. Here he's severing them kind of from their mythic underpinnings, from their roots, but obviously we're recycling a great deal. And as I've discussed before, we're specifically recycling as we get into the woodland realm, the kingdom of Doriath and Beleriand. If you have read your Silmarillion, a lot of this stuff is going to feel very familiar. Thranduil, the Elven King, forgive me, is kind of a budget version, dollar general kind of recreation of King Thingol of Doriath. This is a very familiar kind of setup. And that leaves us in a weird place because it's also very much not, right? For all that is true from a certain perspective, there are other perspectives wherein that comparison makes no sense. It doesn't really hold water at all. So I want to get into this and talk, I guess, a little about the political imaginary of Professor Tolkien at this point. We're certainly going to be talking a little bit about Bilbo's luck, and we're going to be talking about the way in which the kind of operative qualities of the woodland realm create friction in our understanding of who and what elves are. Let's get into it with our pre-elf slide, I guess, here with the capture of the dwarves by the elves. Except for Thorin, of course, who has been missing for a little while already. The day after the battle with the spiders, Bilbo and the dwarves made one last despairing effort to find a way out before they died of hunger and thirst. They got up and staggered on in the direction which 8 of the 13 of them guessed to be the one in which the path lay, but they never found out if they were right. Such day as there ever was in the forest was fading once more into the blackness of night when suddenly out sprang the light of many torches all around them like hundreds of red stars. Out leapt wood elves with their bows and spears and called the dwarves to halt. There was no thought of a fight. Even if the dwarves had not been in such a state that they were actually glad to be captured, their small knives, the only weapons they had, would have been of no use against the arrows of the elves that could hit a bird's eye in the dark. So they simply stopped dead and sat down and waited, all except Bilbo, who popped on his ring and slipped quickly to one side. That is why when the elves bound the dwarves in a long line one behind the other and counted them, they never found or counted the Hobbit. In the earlier drafts of this sequence, in the very earliest drafts of this sequence, Bilbo was supposed to, at this point, have taken a ball of spider thread that he was winding through the forest like Theseus in the labyrinth. In those earlier versions, the solution to the dwarves' imprisonment involved Bilbo finding his way back out through the Mirkwood all the way to Beorn and Gandalf, who was then still called Bloodorthin. The whole idea was dropped, and Bilbo thus never finds his ball of spider twine, except for one reference much later in the text. When Bilbo is circuitously introducing himself to Smaug, he says, "I am the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number." And clue here is, I think, taking its original meaning in Middle English, which is a ball of thread or yarn. It isn't until the late 16th century that the word takes on its modern meaning as something that points toward the solution of a puzzle. I obviously would not put it past Professor Tolkien to be leaning on those alternate meanings and kind of folding them in together, leaning on the irony there. But certainly the older version of the word has a greater direct significance, a greater direct meaning, I think, right here in the text than this vague idea that Bilbo discovered a clue. I've seen people argue online that what he's talking about there is the door to the Lonely Mountain. And my response to that, my opposition to that idea is that is not a clue as much as it is the thing that they were looking for, right? That is the goal. That is the objective. That is not a sign on the path that can lead you there. Hugh was asking, at some point, can you give a definition of eucatastrophe? Wow, I guess there's maybe no better time for that than tonight, in fact, Hugh, because we are, as I say, we're going to be talking a lot about, let me come back to the camera for this. We're going to be talking a lot tonight about Bilbo's luck. We have been talking a lot about Bilbo's luck. There are something like 50 instances of the word luck or lucky or luckily in the pages of The Hobbit. And fully half of them, slightly more than half of them, appear in 3 chapters. Flies and Spiders, which we discussed last time, Barrels Out of Bond, which we're discussing tonight, and Inside Information that we'll get to in a couple of weeks, which is the chapter in which Bilbo slips inside the mountain and has his conversation with Smaug. Those are the focal points of Bilbo's luck, and we are really emphasizing there. I mean, in Inside Information, that is the point at which, like, the subtext of Bilbo's luck becomes this glaring, unambiguous orchestral text. And it's not maybe completely fair to draw a direct one-to-one comparison between Bilbo's luck as we see it in The Hobbit and the greater idea of eucatastrophe in Tolkien's Legendarium, but I don't think that it's unfair either, right? Tolkien is leaning, as he introduces us to right at the beginning of The Hobbit, when he's talking about the unexpected luck of widows' sons, right? When Bilbo is speculating about the kinds of stories that Gandalf was involved with and told, he introduces the idea of luck as being this fairy tale element, very consistent with the kind of story that The Hobbit at least begins as. It doesn't quite end up there, but it does begin as kind of a fairy tale story. Notionally, eucatastrophe is simply this: the idea that something must break, the world must break, fortunes must break in order for there to be an intercession of unexpected grace. We can think of this very kind of glibly, very flatly, and in a way that is insufficient for Tolkien, I will say that, as a kind of deus ex machina miracle that saves the protagonist, that saves the day right when the hero needs it most, right when the chips are down, right when it seems as though all is lost. Something intercedes and saves the day, right? So Tolkien is developing this idea of catastrophe, right? The Greek word catastrophe, and he's splitting it into two different roots. Eucatastrophe, which means like a good turning point, a good reversal, or a dystastrophe, which is a word that never really gained much traction, meaning the bad version, right? What we usually think of colloquially, commonly, as eucatastrophe. What is important about eucatastrophe as a kind of cosmological, theological underpinning of all of Tolkien's work is that it is rooted in the belief that there is, behind everything, a benevolent God. And that when the world breaks, when there are these moments of loss, these moments of heartache, when things look their darkest, that is the moment. That affords an opportunity for the light to get through. I quoted in, I think, yesterday's show, the brilliant Leonard Cohen song Anthem. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, which is what I always think of when I'm thinking of these notions of Tolkienian eucatastrophe. So the idea of eucatastrophe, the idea of luck betraying Tolkien's belief and the truth in his, fictional world as it's presented to us. The idea that luck and eucatastrophe betray this idea that under the surface of everything, there is an inescapable good. That is a very powerful idea. And I was discussing a little in yesterday's show that, in fact, eucatastrophe almost never is the direct Deus Ex Machina intervention of Iluvatar. The as I said in yesterday's show, the pointing finger of God touching the world in just the right place to make everything turn out for the best. It is usually a Rube Goldberg machine of other choices and other motivations and other influences, other characters acting according to their own free will and desires that come together into this beautiful moment of realization. And I'll say too that eucatastrophe, for all that it is a theological underpinning, it is also a powerful narrative underpinning, because Tolkien understood that this moment when everything seems, when all is lost and then suddenly something is revealed, something is shown to be true, that instead leads to victory, that leads to something profound and beautiful and all the more fragile for the experience of that despair, that moment of loss, that narratively, it doesn't get any better than that. Like, narratively, that is the juice. Narratively, it is Éomer standing on the Pelennor field as he's watching the Corsairs of Umber sail up the Anduin, and he is despairing, but then the banner unfurls, and holy crap, it's Aragorn here to save the day. Or it's, in a much more grim example, it is Gollum leaping for Frodo and biting off his finger and tumbling into the lava. This moment of absolute darkest despair that is revealed to be suddenly a moment of grace, a moment of blessing, a moment of miracle. So that is like the idea, the core idea of eucatastrophe, which is found all the way through all of Tolkien's writings. But in The Hobbit, there are moments of eucatastrophe, I think we can argue, toward the end, but I think it's probably fairer to say that eucatastrophe is more generally aligned as luck. And you have to think about the quality of luck that Bilbo has experienced already. Never mind, the dwarves in general. I mentioned this when we got to Rivendell, and Elrond is looking at the map that Gandalf has given to Thorin, and the moon letters are revealed, and how rare that event is. I mean, Elrond calls it out. Like this would only happen, I think it's like on one day every 30 years. That's when the moon letters would show up. And of course, that just happens to be the day that they get to Rivendell. And that's it. Not just a day that they are in Rivendell, the day that they get there. Because if they had looked at the map the previous evening, Elrond would have held it up and said, yeah, there sure aren't any moon letters here. I probably don't need to look at this again during the rest of your stay. And that would have been it. But these events are lining up. And this orchestration of events, the way that luck breaks in The Hobbit, I think is a reflection of that same eucatastrophic impulse, that same understanding that behind the world, there is a goodness, and that evil is temporary, that it is inconvenience, that it is aberrant, that evil is the marring of the world, and it will be ultimately undone. It will be ultimately resolved. That is absolutely a part of Tolkien's most profound moral belief, is that evil is not a balance to the good in the world. Evil was a mistake. Evil was a temporary interruption to the quality of your service as a person living in the manifest world, and that will be corrected. And ultimately, we will get to the point where everything is good. So I hope that helps, Hugh, and I hope that helps kind of seat our discussion as we see some really implausible luck. We're going to be talking about the arrival of wine, we're going to be talking about a series of events that is almost, the narrator is almost like stacking these events one on top of the other, like they're Jenga blocks as we're getting toward the end of the plot to liberate the dwarves from the dungeons of Thranduil, the Elven King. And it's reflective, I think. Well, this is the problem. Because in this chapter, I don't think it completely works. There it is. In this chapter, I don't think that the conflict between the book that was and the book that is going to be completely works. You know what? Let's circle back to that discussion right at the end of tonight's session, because we may as well throw forward to all of our other discussions as we go. We'll kind of get through everything we've got to talk about and then circle back to this idea of whether or not this chapter fits, whether or not it works, and whether or not this is the chapter that could have been most benefited by that 1960 fifth phase rewrite that Tolkien was undertaking, this sadly aborted attempt to rewrite the whole of The Hobbit in a Lord of the Rings compatible tone and register. Let's get back to to the slide. I wanted to call this back up. There's one more thing that I wanted to call out here, which is actually tying into the Lord of the Rings, of course, which is Bilbo putting on the ring. Now, obviously, this is not intentional as Tolkien is writing The Hobbit. Well, it's intentional as Tolkien is writing The Hobbit that Bilbo puts on the ring and evades capture so that he can later rescue the elves, so that we can have Bilbo living this burglarious life inside of the halls of the Elven King for, the better part of a month. But what else is happening here, if you are coming to this book fresh from The Lord of the Rings, is that you can feel the influence of the ring. It's perhaps attributable to the ring, this decision to put it on and vanish from sight, because we have to wonder what would have happened if Thranduil had, either by finding it on Bilbo after throwing him into a dungeon with the other dwarves, or finding this invisible burglar who has been predating on his meals and wine in the halls there, if he had found the ring. Thranduil, I think we can be pretty confident, would not be a good ring bearer. Thranduil would probably not be the most the most beneficial bearer of the ring. So let's keep moving on here. So this is it. This is the capture, right? This is as far as we get with the dwarves kind of figuring out their way through. And I guess it is interesting here too that what we see here is a kind of a rudimentary democracy taking place, because Thorin has been captured. Thorin is gone. So instead, they vote. They got up and staggered on in the direction which 8 of the 13 of them guessed to be the one in which the path lay. That's it, just a direct vote. And what's interesting there is that it's 13. So Bilbo is being counted. He is now a member of the company. Their esteem for him has been raised. And exactly how we situate Bilbo vis-a-vis the dwarves does vary. I'm not sure that Tolkien has a completely consistent handle on the relationship there. As he's revising this, as we're moving through from chapter to chapter, as we're moving through from adventure to adventure, from incident to incident, I'm not completely convinced that there is a smooth curve of evolution here in terms of Bilbo's relationship with the dwarves, but here we can certainly infer that they are counting him as one of them. So Bilbo finds Thorin inside the. I guess we've got some more. We've got some more slides to do. I'm not even there yet. Now that we are captured by the elves, we wind up inside the woodland realm, which, as I say, is very reminiscent of Menegroth and Doriath of Nargothrond. If you are reading your Silmarillion, you are aware of the idea of the elves residing in these beautiful caves. We even mimic the detail here of Menegroth, of the halls of King Thingol, that the great stone pillars are carved and crafted to look like immense trees. Again, auto-plagiarism per John Ratliff there, Tolkien kind of recycling his own ideas, which does sit uncomfortably, right? This is one of the... Well, let's take a look at the next slide. Let's confront the Elven King, and now we're going to talk a little about how these elves sit alongside the others that we have seen to date. Inside, the passages were lit with red torchlight, and the elf guards sang as they marched along the twisting, crossing, and echoing paths. These were not like those of the goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep underground, and filled with a cleaner air. In a great hall, the pillars hewn out of the living stone, sat the Elven King on a chair of carven wood. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for the autumn was come again. In the spring, he wore a crown of woodland flowers. In his hand, he held a carven staff of oak. The prisoners were brought before him, and though he looked grimly at them, he told his men to unbind them, for they were ragged and weary. Besides, they need no ropes in here, said he. There is no escape from my magic doors for those who are once brought inside. Long and searchingly he questioned the dwarves about their doings and where they were going to and where they were coming from, but he got little more news out of them than out of Thorin. They were surly and angry and did not even pretend to be polite. "What have we done, O king?" said Balin, who was the eldest left. "Is it a crime to be lost in the forest, to be hungry and thirsty, to be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pets if killing them makes you angry?" Which is, of course, exactly the wrong thing to say. We are told that, in fact, the spiders are the only things for which the elves hold hatred. They are the elves' only real enemy. There are a couple things here that I find really fascinating. One such example, right? The Elven King's use of the word magic is fascinating because it contrasts very directly with what Galadriel says in The Lord of the Rings when she objects to the use of the word magic because, well, this is the quote. This is what she says to Sam, quote, "For this is what your folk would call magic, I believe, though I do not understand clearly what they mean, and they seem to use the same words of the deceits of the enemy. But this, if you will, is the magic of Galadriel. Did you not say that you wish to see elf magic?" Thranduil, on the other hand, the Elven King here, quite comfortable using the word magic. The narrative voice will use the word magic in just a moment to kind of reiterate the point, to kind of settle it in the reader's imagination. And yes, we can speculate whether there was some, narrative movement here. Is this the quasi-modern, the quasi-contemporary narrator kind of pushing into the text to settle things for the juvenile audience? Possibly. But it is an odd idea. The idea of the elves seeing the enchantment, which we just discussed as being an innate quality of the road, for instance, right, is here presented as a magic that has been worked by the elves. It is a thing that has been done. And this is just one of the ways in which the positioning of the elves of the Woodland Realm is so odd, because despite a lot of legwork done in the fan community and the critical community, the academic community in the years since the publication of The Hobbit, it doesn't really fit with what we see either in The Lord of the Rings or in the Silmarillion, and partly, I will say that is partly not a problem with The Hobbit, right? Because if you are reading The Hobbit in 1937, this is fine. Everything makes complete sense. Like, it's odd, it's strange, it's maybe a little otherworldly, it's maybe a little unsettling, it's extremely fairy, capital F, but it reads as part of a cohesive whole. They are different from the elves of Rivendell. That is established in the text, and that's kind of all we need to know. But because in The Lord of the Rings, Legolas is kind of axiomatically presented as the archetypal elf. He is the paragon of elfness. He is the representative of elvendom in the Fellowship. And Legolas doesn't seem like a terribly good fit in this kingdom as it's presented. You really have to want it, quite frankly. You really have to want to settle that character in this environment. Particularly, when we're thinking about its servants and we're thinking about what is clearly, a set of social classes. Is there a servant class in Rivendell? I'm not at all sure that there is. Are the Tralalalali elves like the working class elves of Rivendell? Is that what we're to infer? Because that is certainly not how they are presented at the time. But the idea that there are servants here, the idea that there are working class elves, the idea that some of the elves here live in huts and some live in the trees outside, right? Very few live in the Woodland Realm's actual capital here. There's this cluster of caves. Most live in the trees or they live in huts outside. We're going to see the raft elves later who absolutely conform to that model. Is that true of the elves of Rivendell? Is that true if we're importing it from The Lord of the Rings of the elves of Lothlorien? Because neither of those seem to operate in quite the same social manner. It feels like a different society that the book is insisting is broadly the same, right? Except The Hobbit isn't really doing that. The Hobbit is quite comfortable with the idea that these are different, that these elves are not like any of the other elves that we will see in Middle-earth, but they are still, as we've been told, good people. Let's keep pushing on and we can find some more points of speculation here. Let's look at poor Mr. Baggins. Poor Mr. Baggins. It was a weary, long time that he lived in that place all alone and always in hiding, never daring to take off his ring, hardly daring to sleep, even tucked away in the darkest and remotest corners he could find. For something to do, he took to wandering about the Elven King's palace. Magic shut the gates, but he could sometimes get out if he was quick. Companies of the Wood Elves, sometimes with the king at their head, would from time to time ride out to hunt, or to other business in the woods and in the lands to the east. Then if Bilbo was very nimble, he could slip out just behind them, though it was a dangerous thing to do. More than once he was nearly caught in the doors as they clashed together when the last elf passed. Yet he did not dare to march among them because of his shadow, altogether thin and wobbly as it was in torchlight, or for fear of being bumped into and discovered. And when he did go out, which was not very often, he did no good. He did not wish to desert the dwarves, and indeed, he did not know where in the world to go without them. He could not keep up with the hunting elves all the time they were out, so he never discovered the ways out of the wood, and was left to wander miserably in the forest, terrified of losing himself until a chance came of returning. He was hungry too outside, for he was no hunter. But inside the caves, he could pick up a living of some sort by stealing food from store or table when no one was at hand. I am like a burglar that can't get away but must go on miserably burgling the same house day after day, he thought. This is the dreariest and dullest part of this wretched, tiresome, uncomfortable adventure. I wish I was back in my hobbit hole, by my own warm fireside with the lamp shining. He often wished, too, that he could get a message for help sent to the wizard, but that, of course, was quite impossible. And he soon realized that if anything was to be done, it would have to be done by Mr. Baggins, alone and unaided. Here we have one of those moments where if you're reading the history of The Hobbit by John Ratliff, if you're looking at the kind of textual development, the compositional history of this book, you kind of find Tolkien arguing with himself, kind of reassuring himself, I suppose, making an argument to himself that actually the previous idea was not the right one. This is the way to go. And here he is kind of addressing that prior idea of, well, Bilbo could just, follow this line of spider thread all the way back through the forest, all the way back to the path, find his way back through the western gate, find his way somehow all the way back without ponies or food or sustenance of any kind, back to Beorn's house, where coincidentally he would find Gandalf. No, it has to be Bilbo. Which is, I think, partly why later on, as I was discussing last week, Tolkien goes back to Flies and Spiders and inserts Bilbo's first kind of heroic encounter, right? This is the moment where he becomes a fantasy hero in the truest sense. He backports that so that we can find this moment of Bilbo's sadness and desperation and loneliness here, kind of consistent with what has come before, but also believe that he would then choose to take action, that if it were to be done, it would have to be done by Mr. Baggins alone and unaided. This is not the first time that he has faced, well, terrible odds, though perhaps he has never faced odds quite as terrible as these. As we call out here, not the first nor the last time that he would wish that he was back in his home. Let's push on then, because we're already kind of running overdue. So Bilbo finds Thorin eventually, right? As he's looking around. Oh, Hugh calls this out. Yes, I meant to talk about this, Hugh. This is brilliant. Hugh says, interesting that there do not seem to be any adverse effects by wearing the ring for an entire month. Yes, this is so often overlooked. It was a weary long time that he lived in that place all alone, and always in hiding, never daring to take off his ring, hardly daring to. He wears the ring for a month. He's not just putting it on when there are guards nearby. He's not just putting it on when he is sneaking an apple pie off of a windowsill like he is some kind of cartoon itinerant hobo, right? Bilbo wears the ring for a full month, and as Hugh calls out, there don't seem to be any adverse effects. This is another way in which we would be looking for revision if Tolkien had made it as far as this chapter in that 1960 fifth phase revision of the entire text. But certainly this is incompatible. This was, I remember, the discussions prior to the release of The Desolation of Smaug. This was one of those conversations that people were having about, well, how is Bilbo going to live in Thranduil's halls for a month with, that ring effect, that desaturated, whooshy kind of blurred ring effect happening all the time. For what it's worth, I think that Jackson manages to mediate it quite well. And certainly the, that Jacksonian compression of time is really effective. I don't know how long the dwarves are there in the movie version. I don't really, you could go mad. You could go mad, I tell you, trying to follow the timeline of those films. But certainly it doesn't feel like a month. And it certainly is also true that it's not quite the Frodo era, intensity of the ring effect. I really like that choice, actually, to simply diminish it, to simply make it otherworldly, to make it weird, but not to make it as malevolent, I think is a really strong design choice, executed very well, I think, throughout that trilogy. Weirdly, the ring, not at all a problem for me in those Hobbit movies. Let's, as I say, so Bilbo is investigating, he's exploring just to fill the time more than anything else, and he finds eventually all of the dwarves sequestered away in these different cells all throughout the palace and the hall of the Woodland King, I guess. And that forces me to wonder, is there no jail here? Is there no fixed dungeon in the Woodland King's realm? Is that why they are like put away? They're just like in weird, odd little closets and rooms and little, storage cupboards and what have you. Like a pantry has been cleaned out so that, Biffer can go in there and just be kept there for a month straight. I wonder whether or not that's what we're supposed to infer from their separation and segregation all through their time in the Elven King's halls. So Thorin agrees that, or Thorin suggests with the force of his rule to the other dwarves that there should be no negotiation with the Elven King, that there should be no attempt to ransom, right? Yeah, as Chris is saying, that would make sense. How much crime would there be to punish? Exactly. That was exactly my thought, is what are the circumstances under which the elves of Mirkwood would take a prisoner? One of the stranger consequences, I suppose, of the clean moral schematic as it's presented to us, a problematic moral schematic, but a clean moral schematic nonetheless, right? There are good guys and there are bad guys. And one of the consequences of that is that the good guys don't really take prisoners. That's just not really done. Occasionally, rarely, that is true, right? Perhaps Gollum is perhaps the most significant quote-unquote bad guy prisoner that the good guys ever capture. And of course, he is imprisoned right here in Thranduil's halls too. So you would think that by this point there was maybe like one cell. Maybe that is where Thorin is, right? As Thorin is often the deepest cell, maybe that is the cell where Gollum was kept too. But yeah, and Hugh saying, I thought of the Woodland Elves as being something of a closed society. That's exactly it, right? Doubling down on this idea that not only are they morally very clear on who is good and who is bad, but how much contact do they have with others? Though they do have more contact than we might expect. You know what? We're gonna keep pushing on here because I really want to get to the idea of talking about the positioning of this shard of elven society. Thorin and the dwarves agree that there's no negotiation until it's clear that there's absolutely no other way out, which is a strange decision for people who are aware, thanks to the moon letters on the map, that they are absolutely operating under a pretty strict deadline. It is already approaching the middle of September, and the clock is ticking on Durin's Day at the Lonely Mountain. I do love, through this sequence, the acknowledgement that Thorin is now thinking of Bilbo as the remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins, which is just a really fun turn of phrase. I know that Tolkien is appropriately renowned for not coining but popularizing the phrase cellar door as the most euphonious in all of English, right? The experience of both saying and hearing cellar door together really gives there is a mellifluity to that phrase. But I will say, the remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins, to say that out loud, the meter of that is so fun, it's so bouncy, it's really good, honestly. Like, this entire chapter is kind of worth it just for that phrase. I stopped when I was reading the book today and just kind of put it down and kind of paced around, kind of wishing that I had a pipe that I could puff on, kind of paced around, just repeating to myself, the remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins. Pretty good stuff. Okay, let's get to the positioning of this society then. And one of the stranger things that we have to reconcile with our understanding of what exactly is going on in Thranduil's realm. And I'm talking, of course, about barrels. One day, nosing and wandering about, Bilbo discovered a very interesting thing. The great gates were not the only entrance to the caves. A stream flowed into part of the lowest regions of the palace and joined the forest river some way further to the east, beyond the steep slope out of which the main mouth opened. Where this underground watercourse came forth from the hillside, there was a water gate. There, the rocky roof came down close to the surface of the stream, and from it a portcullis could be dropped right to the bed of the river to prevent anyone coming in or out that way. But the portcullis would often open, for a good deal of traffic went in and out by the Watergate. If anyone had come in that way, he would have found himself in a dark, rough tunnel leading deep into the heart of the hill. But at one point where it passed under the caves, the roof had been cut away and covered with great oaken trapdoors. These opened upwards into the king's cellars. There stood barrels and barrels and barrels, for the wood elves, and especially their king, were very fond of wine, and no vines grew in these parts. The wine and other goods were brought from far away, from their kinsfolk in the south, or from the vineyards of men in distant lands. I mentioned in yesterday's show that I alluded to the old saw that Tolkien doesn't care about the economy, right? That this is an argument that people have had for the longest time. And that is largely true, but I want to note perhaps the biggest of all the transitions that we've been observing as we move through this book. Perhaps the most significant transition, because this, as quiet, as unassuming, as incidental as it may seem, this is when The Hobbit begins to become a fantasy novel. Because the introduction of these wine barrels is the introduction of trade, which is the introduction of politics. The Shire, effectively, doesn't trade, right? By the time we get to The Lord of the Rings, we understand that it trades some pipewood to Bree and possibly to other human settlements in the area, but this seems to be a pretty small-scale operation, at least until the coming of Saruman. We are surprised that pipeweed from the South Farthing has made it as far south as Isengard. Largely, though, particularly in the bounds of The Hobbit, the Shire is independent. This is particularly true in this book, where the Shire basically consists of Bilbo and Bilbo's house and a generalized impressionistic blur of Hobbit culture. Rivendell, similarly, is independent. Beorn is independent. This is the first time that we have seen any kind of formalized civil relationship between what we might think of as states, right? Other elves in the south, also men in the east, a land that will later in this chapter be revealed to be Dorwinion over by the Sea of Rhun, east of the Mirkwood. I think I called up the map here. Did I add the map in at this point? I did. Look at this. Credit to the fantastic LOTRproject.com, without whom, etc., etc. This is just like the open expanse of Rhun here. You can see the Mirkwood in Rivanion there on the western side. You can see Dol Guldur down there in the southwest. You can see the very tip of Lothlorien. You can just see Cars Galathon there, just in the very western corner of the map there. And you can see Erebor at the top. But over this vast expanse, down the river running, we can see the Sea of Rhun, and according to, I believe it is according to the map that was hand-lettered by, or hand-annotated and then lettered by the illustrator Pauline Baynes, perhaps most well-known for illustrating the Narnia books for C.S. Lewis, of course. She had a map that had been hand-annotated by the professor, kind of adding in more place names, more detail, and I believe that it is in that map that we situate Dorwinion there in that spur, in the crook of the river running to the northwest of the Sea of Rhun, about which, of course, we know nothing. We know basically nothing about Dorwinion, except that it is, to a casual glance, Dor meaning land, Ion, being the modifier there, and Win kind of looking a lot like wine. Is it possible that this was just intended to be the land of wine? I can't really believe that the professor would compose this word so simply, but there it is. The point is this. We are, for the first time, establishing long-term trading relationships. Long-term enough that there is actual infrastructure associated with the shipping of the barrels back down the river. And I'm not just talking about the trapdoors and the portcullis. I'm talking about the raft elves. There is a system in place because the amount of trade that is taking place is so significant, which means that there is a system of trade. And a system of trade means a system of economics and a system of diplomacy. We are, for the first time, thinking of these isolated places as being in relationship the one with the other. And this is going to be completely vital as we move into the back half of the story. Because it's not terribly important just in terms of the wine in the Elven King's halls. It's not the most important thing about the wine, honestly, which we'll discuss a little more in a little while. But it marks this huge transition from the directly personal to the political, because the woodland realm and Lake Town and Dale and Erebor exist in a political context. This is not true of the Bag Ant that we saw at the beginning of the book, the Rivendell that we saw at the beginning of the book, Beorn's house that we saw at the beginning of the book. And this is important because, in part, it is very tempting to backfill all of the stuff we know from the Legendarium, right? We want to draw from our extensive knowledge of the Lord of the Rings and add it back into this book, but this is the first time that it happens in The Hobbit. And it is revealing, I think, just how much the book changes from chapter to chapter and just how much the book changes from this point going forward. So, with all of that said, let me call up the next slide and we'll talk about the wine specifically. If I can get my slides to play nicely. There we are. The evening meal had been taken to the prisoners. The guards were tramping away down the passages, taking the torchlight with them and leaving everything in darkness. Then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the chief of the guards good night. "Now come with me," he said, "and taste the new wine that has just come in. I shall be hard at work tonight, clearing the cellars of the empty wood, so let us have a drink first to help the labour." Very good, laughed the chief of the guards. I'll taste with you and see if it's fit for the king's table. There is a feast tonight, and it would not do to send up poor stuff. When he heard this, Bilbo was all in a flutter, for he saw that luck was with him, and he had a chance at once to try his desperate plan. He followed the two elves until they entered a small cellar and sat down at a table on which 2 large flagons were set. Soon they began to drink and laugh merrily. Luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo then. It must be potent wine to make a wood elf drowsy. But this wine, it would seem, was the heady vintage of the great gardens of Dorwinion, not meant for his soldiers or his servants, but for the king's feasts only, and for smaller bowls, not for the butler's great flagons. Butler here, I take to be kind of not quite used in its modern English context, but in the older context where it is drawn from the French and kind of means something more like sommelier, right? It is kind of more directly connected to bottles of wine, which makes a lot more sense than having this butler who really only has one job, which is checking out the king's wine stash. Wine isn't exactly rare in Tolkien's work. There's wine at the unexpected party in this book, and we know that they make wine in the South Farthing. The Rohirrim drink wine, as do the men in the employ of Saruman. We find out after Merry and Pippin plunder the stash at Isengard that there is good wine there. Denethor calls for wine in Minas Tirith. Faramir's men in Ithilien drink a pale yellow wine, cool and fragrant. But this is the only sequence in all of Tolkien's work in which elves, in the mainstream published work, in which elves are seen to drink wine. There's only a single reference to elves drinking wine in the Silmarillion, and it is a dismissive reference to people behaving as though they are drunk on wine rather than drinking wine itself. Because in The Lord of the Rings, both the elves of Lothlorien and of Rivendell drink Mirivor, which is the honey mead that they teach you how to make in Valinor, because sure, what use are minor deities if they can't teach you how to make a moonshine in a bathtub? So why are the elves of the Woodland Realm hooked on imported wine? Well, partly, of course, because Tolkien needed a way to incapacitate the guards and to get the dwarves out of their predicament, but it does sit strangely with what we see from the elves in the rest of the books. It is kind of hard to imagine a bunch of elves getting trashed on wine. It's directly contradictory to what we get in the movies, thanks to the completely unnecessary drinking competition between Legolas and Gimli. But even if we're just looking at the text of the books, it feels odd. It is hard to imagine Elrond kind of getting a little squiffy on a nice Beaujolais. We have a lot of work to do. We have to erect a lot of scaffolding to really make sense of what's happening here, except, of course, for the points of comparison that have nothing to do with the elves of Middle-earth and everything to do with the elves of Faerie, because wine and food and intoxication, festivals, feasts, and yes, even sex, these are all parts of the traditional allure of Faerie. So if they fit less well here with what will eventually be taken to be elves of Middle-earth largely like any other, they actually fit beautifully with the version of the Woodland Realm that is more consistent with the kind of fairy folk that we were discussing in last week's session, with the wild hunt and these sparkling firelights out in the forest. You know, that kind of fairy elvendom is actually very consistent with extremely potent, extremely heady wine. I also really wanted to look here at the use of luck. As I said, we're calling it out how often luck is used, how often luck is mentioned, but twice in a paragraph is really leaning pretty hard on the idea. When he heard this, Bilbo was all in a flutter, for he saw that luck was with him, and then 2 sentences later, luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo then. Right? The narrative voice is really stressing how unlikely all of this is, and it's not just unlikely because this plan that Bilbo has just conceived is now apparently open to exploitation. It's this entire set of circumstances. It's overhearing the butler, overhearing Galrion and the chief of the guards having this brief conversation, knowing that this then is his window. It's the fact that there is a feast happening upstairs, so most of the elves of Thranduil's Hall are going to be distracted. And if the potency of this wine is anything to go by, they might well all be drunk too. I just inadvertently mentioned the name of the butler there, Galrion. Notably, hey, trivia fans, here's a good one to have in your back pocket if you ever go off to do Lord of the Rings trivia. Galrion is the only elf who is named in The Hobbit, because technically Elrond is half-elven. So it doesn't quite count. He has chosen the fate of elves. He has chosen the fate of the firstborn children of Iluvatar. But technically, Galrion is the only one who gets a name in the entire book. So that's got to be worth like 5 points, some kind of bonus round somewhere in some Lord of the Rings pub trivia. The other elves, then, the luck just continues, right? As Bilbo begins to kind of put his plan together, the other elves arrive to help Gowrion with his work. They take a moment to wake him from his stupor. They say, hey, these barrels are clearly full. Are you sure that this is right? And he, in his drunkenness, in his belligerence at having been awoken, says, you shut the hell up. I am the sommelier of Thranduil's kingdom, and I'm telling you that those barrels are empty. And the other elves just go along with it. Let's pull that... I think I have that slide, in fact. Let me see here. Yes. Get on with the work, growled the butler. There is nothing in the feeling of waiting in idle tosspots' arms. There are the ones to go and no others. Do as I say. Very well, they answered, rolling the barrels to the opening. On your head be it if the king's full butter tubs and his best wine is pushed into the river for the lake men to feast on for nothing. Roll, rolling down the hole. Heave, ho, splash, plump. Down they go, down they bump. So they sang as first one barrel and then another tumbled into the dark opening and was pushed over into the cold water some feet below. Some were barrels really empty, some were tubs neatly packed with a dwarf each, but down they all went, one after another, with many a clash and a bump, thudding on top of the ones below, smacking into the water, jostling against the walls of the tunnel, knocking into one another, and bobbing away down the current. A very brief and somewhat orcish, somewhat goblin-y kind of work song happening here, right? Roll. This is lacking a certain quality, a certain standard from the elves, which is highlighted by the fact that we then get a much more fully developed barrel song, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Of course, we should note here too that the dwarves are not being packed in wine barrels. Wine barrels are traditionally much smaller than the kind of barrels used to pack produce. And the reason that we know they're not in wine barrels is that wine barrels are not designed to be opened and then closed again. They are designed to be broached with a tap, right? You kind of crack a cask of wine rather than opening it very carefully from the top and dipping into it. And we get this account that there are apples, as Hugh has said in the chat here, right? Wine and apples. Yes, apples and butter, and we can speculate other produce here too, though the apples that you would get in the woodland realm, I'm sure, as the fall is coming on, must be spectacular, right? Maybe this is another part of the political dimension of the woodland realm, is that they just charge tourists a lot of money to go out into the extensive orchards, just on the very fringes of the Mirkwood. You don't want to go too far in. Apples and cobwebs don't really mix that well, but right there on the fringes, there are some beautiful orchards. You can go and pluck a Honeycrisp and spend your whole morning getting apples that you could otherwise buy. I'm being very snide about this. I don't know why. I genuinely love apple picking. It was one of the best things about living in New York was every year I lived a long way upstate, up by Syracuse, and every year the apple picking was just spectacular. And this is a pleasure that I do not get down here in Oklahoma. So maybe that is why I am being a little snide. Thank you for joining me for this therapy session. Let's quickly, I'm looking at the time and realizing that I'm going to have to cut at least one thing. So let's take a look at the barrel song, because you know me well enough to know that we are not going to cut the poem. And as this slide is transitioning, I will observe again, right, the luck of this. It isn't just that Gowrion and the chief of the guards both get knocked out on this Dorwinian wine. It isn't just that the feast upstairs is distracting everyone and kind of hurrying the workers as they're loading the barrels so that they can go back and join the party again. It isn't just that everyone is very distracted. It is all of these things happening at exactly the same time. This perfect confluence. Anyway, this is the barrel song. This is it's a 7-syllable metrical rhythm. It's basically 3 pairs of trochaic stress, unstress syllables, and then 1 extra catalectic foot. So it's most, if you like, it's half of a trochaic or 3.5 of a trochaic tetrameter here. This is how it goes. Down the swift dark stream you go, back to lands you once did know. Leave the halls and caverns deep, leave the northern mountains steep. Here the forest wide and dim stoops in shadow grey and dim. Float beyond the world of trees, out into the whispering breeze, past the rushes, past the reeds, past the marshes waving weeds, through the mist that riseth white, up from mere and pool at night. Follow, follow, stars that leap, up the heavens cold and steep. Turn when dawn comes over land, over rapid, over sand, south the way and south the way. Seek the sunlight and the day. Back to pasture, back to mead, where the kine and oxen feed. Back to gardens on the hills, where the berry swells and fills. Under sunlight, under day, south the way and south the way. Down the swift dark stream you go, back to lands you once did know. And it's so tempting and yet impossible to imagine the 17-year-old working the parking lot of your local grocery store, collecting, the shopping carts that have been left by drivers just casually in parking spots all across this asphalt expanse, and kind of rounding them all up and carrying them back with this kind of care and diligence, is my point. It's so lovely. And it's not just a really nicely composed song. It is a nicely composed song. I'm not sure that the particular metrical pattern here tells us anything particularly significant about its elvishness, right? It doesn't feel like an elven song as we have discussed them previously. It almost feels like a different kind of song. The closest substantive comparison that we can make, I think, is to the dwarf song, in fact, that is sung back in Beorn's house in chapter 7, though that song is in iambic tetrameter, right? But what happens is, I'm reading this as a trichaic tetrameter dropping the last syllable, but you could also read it as an iambic tetrameter dropping the first syllable, that is, coming in not on the first unstressed syllable, but on the first stressed syllable. So here, down the swift dark stream you go. We can compare this to the dwarf poem, the wind was on the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf. If we cut the first unstressed syllables from each line of that poem, we get, wind was on the withered heath, in the forest stirred no leaf, shadows lay by night and day, dark things silent crept beneath. It is exactly the same metrical structure. It's exactly the same pattern there, which I just think is just fantastic. I will say that the Dwarven song has a slightly more complicated rhyme structure. It has that ABCA kind of structure there, whereas this is just a very straight AABB kind of structure, go and no, deep and steep, dim and grim. But we pull kind of the same idea here, right? Because you'll remember that the dwarf song is about the wind coming out of the west and reaching the lonely mountain and then ascending into the sky. And that's, we kind of get part of that here, right? Up from Mir and through the mist that riseth white, up from Mir and Pool at night, follow stars that leap up the heavens cold and steep. But then we bring it back down. Turn when dawn comes over land, over rapid, over sand, south away and south away. We're still here. There's this moment of almost exaltation there. But then when dawn comes, we are returned to the world of daylight. We are returned to barrels bouncing down the river, heading down all the, south away, back to Dorwinion, back to the Sea of Rhun, back to this place where there are pastures and meads, where the kine and oxen feed. Kine, an old plural form for cow there, right? We're talking about cattle here. Back to the gardens on the hills where the berry swells and fills under sunlight under day. Those are the vineyards that we're singing about. So it's go and return to your home and get more wine. That's the song. And I really love it. It's a very incidental piece, right? It is a very inessential piece, I suppose you could say, but I genuinely love this song. I think it's very good. And again, Tolkien's mastery of what is, in this instance, a fairly simple metrical pattern is still, I think, astonishing. The way that we build the rhythm, the way that we build the power, the way that we build the pace and the romance. I am struck. I am touched by that south away, right? The repetition of that, I think, is really, really beautiful. And of course, we're evoking this idea too of returning home, which is, as a thematic construction, a really beautiful one. Because of course, who is returning home in these barrels that have just been bounced down through the trapdoor into the stream beneath, but the dwarves. And of course, Bilbo. I'll cover this very quickly. I was going to go into a deeper thing about this, but we still have 2 slides that I want to cover tonight before we wrap up. So I'll cover this very quickly. But one of the ways in which you can see that this part of The Hobbit is not completely integrated with what Tolkien understood of his legendarium, certainly kind of post-Lord of the Rings, right? And of course it wasn't, because it was written 20 years before that. But one of the ways that you can tell in which we ought not perhaps to treat these as completely equivalent texts in terms of their depth is Bilbo jumps into the river. He's holding on to the barrel. He survives all the way down the river. And he, at one point, thinks about swimming across to the bank from the barrel that he is clinging to. And Bilbo's a hobbit. Hobbits don't like swimming. Hobbits are fearful of exactly this kind of water. This is clearly, I think that Ratliff, in fact, calls this out in the history of the Hobbit. But this is clearly a moment in which Tolkien has not yet come up with that idea. The hobbits are still being developed as he reaches the Lord of the Rings. And he doesn't know at this point, and that is certainly the language that he would use, I'm sure, that he has not yet discovered that hobbits are fearful of the running water. So the implausibility of Bilbo, as we understand hobbits from the Lord of the Rings, just leaping into the water. I mean, maybe leaping into the water in desperation, certainly, but then actually feeling kind of miserable, yes, but also confident in his physical skill inside the water, I think is really interesting. Let's take a look at at our penultimate slide for this evening and this moment of escape, now that we are freed from the woodland realm. Out they went under the overhanging branches of the trees on either bank. Bilbo wondered what the dwarves were feeling and whether a lot of water was getting into their tubs. Some of those that bobbed along by him in the gloom seemed pretty low in the water, and he guessed that these had dwarves inside. I do hope I've put the lids on tight enough, he thought, but before long he was worrying too much about himself to remember the dwarves. He managed to keep his head above the water, but he was shivering with the cold, and he wondered if he would die of it before his luck turned, and how much longer he would be able to hang on, and whether he should risk the chance of letting go and trying to swim to the bank. The luck turned all right before long. The eddying current carried several barrels close ashore at one point, and there for a while they stuck against some hidden root. Then Bilbo took the opportunity of scrambling up the side of his barrel, which was held steady against another. Up he crawled like a drowned rat and lay on the top, spread out to keep the balance as best he could. The breeze was cold, but better than the water, and he hoped he would not suddenly roll off again when they started once more. Before long, the barrels broke free again and turned and twisted off down the stream and out in the main current. Down the stream and out into the main current. Then he found it quite as difficult to stick on as he had feared, but he managed it somehow, though it was miserably uncomfortable. Luckily, he was very light, and the barrel was a good big one, and being rather leaky, had now shipped a small amount of water. All the same, it was like trying to ride without bridle or stirrups a round-bellied pony that was always thinking of rolling on the grass. A really lovely kind of domestic, cozy, rural, rustic kind of metaphor right there at the end to close it off. And if we are thinking about Bilbo's luck, well, how does this grab you? I don't know if I'm going to be able to hold on. I might die before we get to our destination. I am thinking about trying to swim from my barrel to the bank, which will mean leaving the dwarves to whatever fate awaits them, right? He would sunder the party at that point in what would probably be a kind of terminal way. And what happens? Well, the current just carries them ashore, or close to the shore. It stabilizes them for long enough that Bilbo can climb on top, find himself a better purchase, and though it is miserably uncomfortable, as we're told, adopt a survivable position here. Let's close up. Yeah, we really are. I'm running out the clock. I have 1 minute left, and I'm going to overrun because that's just how we do these things here. Let's look at the very end of, or not quite the very end, but the last slide that I pulled for this evening. There was no need to tell you much of his adventures that night, for now we are drawing near the end of the eastward journey and coming to the last and greatest adventure, so we must hurry on. Of course, helped by his magic ring, he got on very well at first, but he was given away in the end by his wet footsteps and the trail of drippings that he left wherever he went or sat. And also, he began to snivel. And wherever he tried to hide, he was found out by the terrific explosions of his suppressed sneezes. Very soon there was a fine commotion in the village by the riverside, but Bilbo escaped into the woods carrying a loaf and a leather bottle of wine and a pie that did not belong to him. The rest of the night he had to pass wet as he was and far from a fire, but the bottle helped him to do that, and he actually dozed a little on some dry leaves, even though the year was getting late and the air was chilly. He woke again with a specially loud sneeze. It was already grey morning, and there was a merry racket down by the river. They were making up a raft of barrels, and the raft elves would soon be steering it off down the stream to Lake Town. Bilbo sneezed again. He was no longer dripping, but he felt cold all over. He scrambled down as fast as his stiff legs could take him and managed just in time to get onto the massive casks without being noticed in the general bustle. Luckily, there was no sun at the time to cast an awkward shadow, and for a mercy he did not sneeze again for a good while. A last act of luck here, a last moment of small eucatastrophe to get him onto the raft of barrels that is now going to be sent down to the Long Lake. And it really brings a beautiful kind of culmination to Bilbo's adventure, to the month that he just spent in the Woodland Realm. Like, for all that this is a fairly brief chapter and we've kind of called out all of the high points, there is a large passage of time, and we are again seeing that Bilbo has been changed by the experience. We don't quite get the emphatic kind of punctuation to Bilbo's experience that we got in Flies and Spiders. Bilbo felt that slaying the spider by himself with the help from the dwarves or the wizard had transformed him into a hero, and he names his sword Sting, and he is a different dude now. Mostly he's going to kind of regress from that, but that is a version of Bilbo that we'll get. But here we're getting the proof of it. He has spent so long in the Woodland Realm that he is now very comfortable, almost grumpily going out to steal food and wine and a pie, right? Bread and wine and a pie, and then settling himself down. And the wine is so comfortable is Bilbo at this point with this burglarious activity that the wine is even able to help him sleep a little bit, though the air is cold. He really is I believe that in exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, Corey Olsen's book, he describes this as Bilbo building his resume, right? That this passage, this series of events basically between Baron's house and Lake Town is Bilbo kind of rounding out his resume. And I think that that's a really good way of looking at it. I think that's a fun bit of interpretation there. And so we are free of Thranduil. We're free of the elves of the woodland realm, and we are ready to move on to Lake Town. And to, as the narrative voice intrudes here at the beginning of this passage, there is no need to tell you much of the adventures that night, for now we are drawing near the end of the eastward journey and coming to the last and greatest adventure. Wow. The narrative voice coming in to say, look, okay, we've had some, we've bounced around a little bit, but now we're really getting to it, which I can't help but feel is indicative of that pause in composition that we discussed right at the beginning of tonight's show, and the outline that Tolkien then wrote, right? The rest of what comes, the rest of the story, even as he had it conceived there, which was much less tight and focused and rigorous than it turns out to be in the finished book. But even that rough schematic feels very different. We are no longer going to bounce from adventure to adventure, from incident to incident. The picaresque part of Bilbo's adventure is over, even in that first crude pre-draft outline of what was going to happen. And we're going to see that turning point really begin in next week's reading here as we get to chapter 10, A Warm Welcome. Let me call this up. Oh, I'm not even observing here that right there at the end of the chapter, we get that ominous note from the narrator that we don't know if the dwarves are living or dead. Spoilers, they're alive. It's going to be okay, you guys. Implausibly as it might be, they're going to be alive. So this is our schedule. October 7th, that is next Thursday night at 9 p.m. Central Time. Chapter 10, A Warm Welcome. October 14th, we're going to be looking at On the Doorstep. And the following week, we're going to get to Smaug. And I am really excited. I think that is going to be just so much fun. So we're really, by the way, I should say here, just to observe the structure of the thing, we're really at the halfway point, right? 19 chapters in The Hobbit. So here we are. We're going to do 20 weeks in total because we had that introductory chapter, but here we are right in the middle of the book. And as I say, this is a very defined and carefully orchestrated turning point in terms of the structure of the book, in terms of Bilbo's adventure, in terms of what we can look forward to in next week's discussion and every discussion thereafter. Chris, Hugh, and Bilbo has a cold, says Hugh. I love so much the effect of Bilbo having a cold. I'm already jumping ahead to next week, but the company being hailed in Lake Town, right, as the fulfillers of this prophecy, and Bilbo is just this miserable, sneezing, wretched mess. Brilliant. Chef kiss, no notes. That is going to do it. I just noticed Chris saying, at least they didn't have a floating battle with orcs. Chris, you know what's crazy is that I have made it through this entire session without thinking about the extremely overblown CGI heavy fight sequence with the orcs and Legolas and Tauriel in the movie version. I might have to go back and watch the movie version. I don't know. Are you guys interested? Would it be fun to go back and I had an idea for looking at each of those three movies, basically splitting them in half, because they all have weirdly like nicely defined middle points where you could really functionally split them, and then kind of doing them 2 weeks apiece and really delving into them. That might not be the best format. Maybe there are other ways of approaching that. I'm not entirely sure, but there is a lot of good in the first one. As I said before, the first one is mostly good. The second one is like half good. The third one is mostly bad. But even then, there are some good things, and it'd be fun to talk about. At least maybe we'll pencil that in for after we're done with The Hobbit. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Hugh, for joining me this evening. Thank you to everyone listening at home. If you have a moment, please do leave a rating. Please do leave a review. If you would like to join me here on a Tuesday evening for this live discussion, if you would like to join me for the after show, whenever the after show is going to be scheduled sometime this week, then head on over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword. You can follow that page for free. That gets you the links in your email very conveniently for the live sessions. And you can also choose, if you're so inclined, to pledge your support to support independent ad-free media in this world that desperately needs more independent ad-free media. If you enjoy the show, please, do something to show that. Please do something to spread the word and help more people find what we're doing here at Shire Reckoning. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for your support. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Hugh. I will talk to you all next week. Until then, take care. Good night, all.